Hi, this is Mahesh Thapa from starvingphotographer.com, and today I want to discuss with you some basics of landscape photography 101 if you will. Quick disclosure, I am a Sony Alpha ambassador and many of the images you see here are taken on the Sony system. So let's keep this quote by Ansel Adams in mind when we talk about photography rules. There are no rules for good photographs. There are only good photographs. So as you go through my lecture, my talk, keep this in the back of your mind. First of all, know your equipment. And what do I mean by that? When you're going out into the wild blue yonder, make sure it's not the first time you're using your camera. Make sure you know where your ISO button is, how you change your aperture, things like that. Second, bring along a sturdy tripod and remote release. Many of the scenes you'll be capturing often are during low light hours where the exposure times are quite prolonged, and the name of the game is having a steady system. And for that, tripod is a must, and if you can swing it, bring a remote release. I know many modern cameras nowadays have the ability to control your system with an app on your phone, but sometimes those apps don't work great. So I always have a backup system such as a cable remote release or a wireless release. And this third thing I try to stress to people, even though this is probably the thing that people look at the least, is investigating weather conditions before going out. You don't want to be driving 12 hours from Seattle to Yellowstone National Park only to find out that the next 4 days is going to be whited out because of a big snowstorm. If that example sounds quite specific, no comment. So, you can't control the weather, obviously, but you can prepare yourself for what's coming and plan your trip accordingly. There are no strict rules as far as what focal length you should use for a particular scene. What you want to achieve compositionally, your personal preference for certain focal lengths. Maybe you're a big wide angle shooter, maybe you like to get intimate with the landscape and use a telephoto lens. That'll really dictate what focal length you use for a particular scene. That being said, in general, I carry 3 types of lenses in my bag. Ultra wide angle lens, a standard zoom, and a medium telephoto. And this slide basically tells you around the range of what I consider ultra-wide, standard, and medium telephoto. If you have these ranges, you'll be ready for 90-95% of landscape photography. Here, for example, is a landscape photograph taken with a 500mm lens. So just don't equate landscape photography with ultra-wide angle lens photography. You can create very compelling compositions with a telephoto lens also, depending on the situation, of course. Another big telephoto lens shot where I've composed the moon with these beautiful sand dunes. This was taken in Death Valley National Park. If you were to divide your scene into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, try to place your main subject somewhere along the thirds. So if I were to divide this like such, one here and one line here, and one line going through here, one line going through here, the subject, which is this goat, is in the lower left third of the image, and he's looking out into the distance. This was taken during one of my hikes on Tuck and Robbins Lake in Washington. Here we have the horizon not in the middle. Actually, it's in the upper 1/3, and the main subject is in the foreground, which is this rock with this nice leading line, and it's located in the lower right-hand corner or lower right-hand 1/3. It's not in the middle over here because I think this is a much more pleasing composition. Again, the rule of thirds coming into play. Here's another example of the rule of 1/3 where I have placed the scampering boy on the right 1/3 of the image. Here's an example of an image taken in the Palouse where I have the subject matter, which is the barn, and this tree in the lower 1/3. The question then becomes, will this image look just as good if we have the subject matter, mainly the tree and the barn, in the left side? I don't think so, because the flow of the image is such that the light is coming from the right-hand side, and you see these long shadows extending from right to left. So if we had the subject matter placed somewhere over here, the shadows would sort of be going out of your field of view, and I think it's a much more pleasing composition in the lower right third as opposed to the lower left third. So here's a corollary to that rule of 1/3, and it has to deal with horizons. Try to place the horizon somewhere in the upper 1/3 or lower 1/3 rather than directly in the center. This was taken at Arches National Park. Here's a shot taken at Death Valley National Park where I have essentially the horizon in the upper 1/3 because the sky above here wasn't very interesting. The interesting part of the sky was just around or just above the horizon where a storm was coming through and it was being lit from the rays of light coming from the right-hand side. But the interesting part about this whole thing is the foreground, I think, these raised edges of these salt flats. Here's an example where the horizon is sort of in the center, but you don't perceive it as center because of the buildings. The buildings sort of pooch up into the sky, and almost like it creates a false horizon that comes up and goes like this. So when you do have a cityscape, don't worry so much about the horizon. And of course, this image is helped by a gorgeous sky and these nice leading lines into the city. Here's an example of an image where I have completely disregarded that rule of the horizon and placed it smack dab in the middle. And it works because of the reflection, because the upper part of the image I think is just as interesting as the bottom part. By the way, these little things you see over here are eagles. This was taken in Haines, Alaska on a beautiful sunset evening. When possible, try to use leading lines or some kind of curve that leads the viewer's eyes into the photograph. One example are train tracks, where I have these train tracks leading directly into the distance, into these beautiful fall colors and this nice golden orb in the sky. This was taken somewhere in eastern Washington. Here's another example of a shot taken somewhere along the dunes. I think this was in Idaho. We've got this beautiful razor sharp edge of the dunes that lead the viewer's eyes directly into the distance and to these beautiful layered clouds at the top. Here's another example of leading lines where I have the flow of water going from the lower left all the way to the upper right. It's almost like you can get on a slide and go slip sliding down this fall into the distance, into this calm water. I think this image would be less pleasing, less powerful if we didn't have the path, because the path now leads the viewer directly into the scene, into this great unknown, misty unknown, if you will, in Redwoods National Park. Here's a shot I took at Palouse Falls during the evening, and you can actually follow this entire composition as we follow the rock edge over here. It takes us to the waterfall. Waterfall hits the water, and the water itself sort of curves along the cavern into the distance. Here's another example of curvy lines leading to the main subject, which is this tree. You can follow these lines over here as it meanders along and goes right to the tree. And the tree, if you notice, is located in the upper left-hand corner, that also is a great pleasing element. More leading lines, so you sort of get the message of what I'm trying to do with these images. These leading lines, basically this is the irrigation pathway that leads to this nice farm and the distant mountains. When possible, try to look for natural frames to surround your subject matter. This was taken in Hawaii, Akaka Falls. This is the Akaka Falls itself. And I've got the foliage here and branches on top with some beautiful light coming in from the top up here that naturally frames the fall itself. This was in Bandon, Oregon, and I was at the beach during low tide, and I sort of went deep into a cave and looked out into the distance, and I was able to frame this rock, and I was even able to get a little bit of moon here. So this natural framing does have a very nice effect on the composition. This is a classic view from Arches National Park, with Tourette Arch being framed by, I think this is north window, and I was lucky enough to get some beautiful light and some nice clouds and the moon. And you can be creative. This was taken actually at Cary Park in Seattle many years ago, where I had my wife press the button for the water fountain, and that created this lovely effect here, which sort of paralleled the outline, if you will, of the rainbow. This was taken at Discovery Park in Seattle. Lots of driftwood there if you ever get out there, and you can see that I have positioned myself such that the driftwood pooches up into the sky and cradles Discovery Park Lighthouse. If you are interested in creating that classic landscape image where you have a prominent foreground, a midground, and a background, this is sort of a quintessential example image that I have. The foreground, of course, are these interesting grass and rock. The midground is going to be your reflection, and your background is Mount Shuksan itself with this beautiful pink sky. Here's another example, just to give you an idea that the foreground and midground don't have to be completely different subjects. It's both flowers, but the foreground flowers are more prominent, more detailed, and sort of fades out into the midground, and the background, of course, is beautiful Mount Rainier with the fog and sky. This was Bass Harbor Light in Acadia National Park. The foreground is these colorful rocks, a little bit of motion on the water. The rock line or the coastline itself leads us to the midground, which is more rocks and Bass Harbor Light, and the distance is, of course, the background with this nice burst of light coming in through the clouds. And finally, a very simple image where the foreground is just a collection of rocks looking misty because of a long exposure effect. This is also taken at Discovery Park. Midground is going to be your water and your mountains, and the background, of course, is this gorgeous sky. One thing I want to emphasize about landscape photography, particularly if you're using ultra-wide angle lenses, is to really get close to your foreground and make it huge. So here, this is taken at Gasworks Park in Seattle, and I have gotten very, very close to the artwork in the foreground such that it's really huge and really takes up a big portion of the image and is really in your face. So it serves as a great foreground with this nice water and hill in the midground, and of course the city and the stormy sky in the background. More examples of foreground, midground, and background: the beautiful wildflowers at Panorama Point in Mount Rainier National Park. The midground, this earth and snow with these leading lines leading away from the foreground into the distant mountain ranges of the Tatoosh Range. And you can actually even see Mount St. Helens over here and Mount Adams over here in a very nice sky. If you notice, many of the images I've shown you are taken during low light conditions, either sunrise, sunset, or plus or minus 1 hour on either side of those two times. That's because that's when you have the best light, early morning or late afternoon. This is a shot at sunrise at Hunts Mesa in Monument Valley National Park. This is a shot with the sun just coming up above the horizon, shining through these beautiful misty environment and these branches creating this great rays of light effect. And this was taken at Redwoods National Park. Again, Death Valley National Park with this beautiful sand dunes, pristine. Nobody has walked down it yet. The light just coming up above the horizon. I see a little bit of texture here and these beautiful undulating lines. Again, notice the 1/3, 2/3 composition with the sun not directly in the middle, but over there on the upper left-hand side. Okay, so as a summary, know the equipment that you're carrying. Make sure you're carrying a tripod and remote release, because a lot of the photographs you take are going to be during very, very low light where the exposure times are prolonged. Know your weather conditions before you head out. Know several of these rules we talked about, such as the rule of thirds, not placing your horizon all the time directly in the center, using leading lines and curves to lead the eyes of the viewer into the photograph, applying natural frames where you can, and if you want that classic landscape image, have something in the foreground, the midground, and the background, and for the best light, shoot during the golden hours. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you've enjoyed this and found it useful. And if you like this video, give me a thumbs up and please subscribe.